This is the third of the talks for my Introduction to Ethics class. We've been talking about rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism says that knowledge comes from your mind. It's there in your mind already before you look out into the world, before you measure things in the world or use your senses. Descartes was a rationalist, as was Spinoza and Leibniz. But of course, the oldest rationalist was Plato, going back to ancient times, who said our mind can leave the material world and enter the world of the forms and learn what's really out there. On the other hand, we've had empiricism. Empiricists were John Locke and George Berkeley, and of course the most famous of the empiricists, who also, because of his empiricism, became a great skeptic, knowing that we can know, or saying we can know very little about the world, was David Hume. But perhaps the most revolutionary philosopher, in my mind, one of the greatest in history, was a man named Immanuel Kant. And it was Kant who tried to put together empiricism and rationalism and came up with a whole new radical way of seeing the universe. Kant said that he put together a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Until Copernicus, everybody thought that the sun went around the earth, that everything was earth-centered. After Copernicus, they realized the earth goes around the sun and became much more sun-centered. It moved the entire focus. Until Kant, everybody thought that we could get a God's eye view of the world, that we could see the world as it really is out there, as God sees it. Kant said, no, we could only see the world as we see it, what he called the turn to the subject. Each of us as individuals can see what the world is all about, but what the world's really like, and he called that the noumenal world, we can never really know. We can only know what our mind sees, and his radical idea was when information comes into our mind organizes it and puts it together in a certain way. And to explain this, I've got to get a little bit technical, so this is probably the hardest part of any of these talks. First of all, philosophers talk about a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge. A priori is before you look out in the world. It's stuff that's already in your mind before you study the world at all. A posteriori is after you look out into the world. It's information that's in your mind only after you study, after you have sense information. And the other great division is between sentences that are true by definition and sentences that are true after you look out in the world. Sentences that are true by definition are called analytic sentences. All bachelors are unmarried men. That's true. How do you know it's true? By definition, it's true. My sister is a girl. I don't have a sister, but if I had one, she'd be a girl. It's true by definition. All triangles have three sides. You don't need to study the world to know that those sentences are true. On the other hand, there are synthetic statements. Those are statements where you need to study the world to know they're true. For example, it's going to rain this afternoon, or it rained this morning. That's not true by definition. It's true only if you study the world. The President of the United States is married. That's not true by definition. We have to follow the news or study or know who he is to know that he's married. So we have a priori statements or facts that are true before you look into the world, and a posteriori after you look into the world. You have analytic statements true by definition, synthetic statements true after we study the world. Now, David Hume said there's only two kinds of knowledge. He combined these two things. David Hume said there is analytic a priori statements. Analytic are things that are true by definition, and we know them without studying the world. And there are synthetic a posteriori statements, things that are true only after knowledge comes into our mind. They're not true by definition. Immanuel Kant came along, and this was his great and famous insight. You may have to watch this a few times to understand it. Immanuel Kant said that there are synthetic a priori statements. By synthetic, they're not true by definition. A priori means they're in our mind before we ever look out into the world. So, for example, before we ever look out into the world at all, we know that every event takes place in time. We know it takes place in space. And we know that because our minds are built that way. Stuff comes into our mind and we can already say that it's true in space, it's true in time. Causation. We see things and we know that everything has a cause. That's not something that's out there in the world, that's something that's true because that's how our mind works. Our mind sees causation. David Hume said there is no causation in the world. We have no proof that anything is caused by anything. Immanuel Kant says the way our mind works, everything has a cause, because that's part of the structure of our mind. So the idea that there are synthetic a priori ideas, ideas that we know are true because our mind is built that way. That is his great insight. So if you take Kant's ideas, our mind is built in a certain way that when stuff comes into it, our mind organizes it according to certain principles within our mind. And therefore we can say certain things are true, although we haven't really looked out into the world. They're not things that have come to us through empiricism. They're things that are already in our mind. We see something and we can say, it has a cause. That's part of how our mind works. Now let me just end this with a quick thought on ethics. Kant also said that there are ethical ideas in our mind, something that we just know without looking out into the world. We know that certain things are wrong and certain things are right. Lying is wrong and stealing is wrong and murder is wrong, because that's in our mind before we ever bother to look out into the world. It's a priori knowledge that these things are wrong, and Kant called those the categorical imperative. The basic understanding of the categorical imperative is act in a way that you would want everybody to act that way. Act in a way that you want it to become a universal law. That idea is in our mind, the way our mind is structured before we ever look out into the world. So Kant, when it came to ethics, was a rationalist. He looked into our mind and not out into the world to understand what's going on. I love Kant because the turn to the mind and the way our mind organizes data, I believe, led directly to Einstein and to quantum physics and all sorts of modern ways of thinking that begin with how does our mind see the world? Not what's the world really like, but how does our mind see it? I hope you understood part of this, and this will help understand where Kant's ethics comes from.